20 minutes or so. Okay, in the panel are Sofia Monsalve of the largest civil society network, the IPC for Food Sovereignty, and the human rights organization Food First Action and Information Network, TIA. Gregory Myers is with USAID, but he is also the chair of the FAO Committee for Food Security Working Group on the Voluntary Guidelines. Ruth Hole is a senior researcher at the Institute of Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of Western Cape. Okay, I think we just open the floor for question and answer.
May I ask a question? I guess this is quite a general question. There was quite a bit of discussion this morning about the role of big industry, what role that they can play. There seems to be kind of a divide between those who think that they do have a role to play, and those who think they should just be shut out completely. Particularly in terms of things like, increasing food production or whatever it is that you're producing. What do you think is big industry's role?
Sure, I'll start. The U.S. Agency for International Development is committed to investing about $3 billion in increasing food security under our Feed the Future strategy. And the focus of that program is on smallholder farmers, and specifically women. But we also see a role for linking those smallholder farmers to commercial sector investors. So our position is that if you can get the governance structure right first, and I do emphasize first, and that governance includes recognizing people's land tenure and property rights, then we think that there are opportunities to create linkages between those smallholder producers and commercial investors in ways that are potential win-win scenarios.
And do they work? I mean, can you actually have practical governance structures that don't just look as though they're giving people rights, but actually do? And then big industry is still interested in participating?
They do work, and in fact, my agency has a lot of experience working in Africa in this area and with a number of successful programs. But I would also suggest that you could look at the green timber movement and the green coffee movement as examples where large commercial enterprises have linked with smallholder producers. I think the coffee movement in Rwanda is a good example. It has resulted in benefits to the industries as well as to the coffee producers.
I mean, there's kind of divide. I took it from the meeting this morning between the kind of position you're representing, the sort of pragmatic kind of what we need is guidelines for how land acquisitions happen. You probably don't like the phrase land grab, I don't know. And the sort of Marxists who would say, most land acquisitions are land grabs, and this is all about kind of class and capital. I mean, is that a fair characterization of the sort of range of people at this meeting?
Well, I represent a human rights organization. We look at this question from that angle, and what we see is widespread and massive human rights violations related to industrial agriculture. I'm referring to forced evictions, which are prohibited by international human rights law. I'm referring to contamination of water, destruction of soils, displacement of communities, destruction of local livelihoods, not only agriculture but also nomadic pastoralism, for instance, fisher folks, women who are highly dependent on common food resources like forests for medicines for many purposes. And we also analyze systemic violations of the right to food when, for instance, the states do policies biased against a small-scale farm. Because according to human rights obligations, states are obliged to use the maximum of available resources to overcome hunger. And what we see is that is not the case, that it is what is happening. The private sector or large-scale companies do receive quite a lot of subsidies, different types and kinds of subsidies. It is not that they are doing that on their own. There are massive subsidies in place to make these businesses happen. So from our point of view, we are highly skeptical, and what we say is that states have to comply with their obligations with the right to food, for instance, but also a full range of other rights, like, for instance, the right to decide what kind of policies, what kind of agriculture peasants, women, pastoralists, indigenous peoples want to have in place.
Can we have a more very quickly?
Yeah. I think that what's being conveyed quite clearly from the papers coming to this conference is that there are procedural concerns about the ways in which large-scale land acquisitions are acquired and contracts confirmed over large areas of land, particularly in Africa. And there are proposals for ways in which to regulate those processes, to ensure that corruption is limited, to ensure that people are consulted, that communities provide free, prior and informed consent. But there is another deeper concern, which is the question about, substantively, what are these large-scale acquisitions doing to systems of food production and natural resource use and natural resource management in developing countries. And I think that while some institutions indicate that it is possible to get the regulations and governance systems right, many of the papers being brought forward at the conference suggest that in practice on the ground, whether or not there are better ways of doing things, a core underlying concern is about the ways in which the food system is being undermined at local levels. So, for instance, we know that between 2/3 and 3/4 of the large-scale land deals that have been confirmed in the past 2 years seem to have been in Africa. Of course, this is a continent that suffers from chronic problems of food insecurity, and yet large organizations, companies, foreign governments look to Africa and the idea that there is a large underutilized land reserve in Africa as a reason why this should be a continent that should help to provide food supply to foreign countries. And I think that therefore what some of the issues that we're discussing here is how is it that a global food system that is already failing up to 2 billion people, leaving people either in hunger or vulnerable to hunger, could be changed further through these acquisitions in ways that might throw larger numbers of people into vulnerability to hunger.
Right. Well, first of all, my apologies for having been late. I was grabbed when having lunch and delayed as a result. My name is Olivier Deschutter, I'm UN Special Rapporteur on Right to Food, and I have been following this issue for the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly, from which I received this mandate of Special Rapporteur on Right to Food. And maybe, at the risk of repeating what may have been said in my absence at the beginning, what I would like to emphasize is the very important debate that is going on between those who promote large-scale, heavily mechanized plantations, practicing a form of agriculture that resembles industry, if you wish, and small-scale farming as is practiced still by the vast majority of the rural poor in developing countries. The debate between these two types of farming and which direction we should try to explore is a debate that is biased in two ways. First, it is biased in that we have never really invested in small-scale family farming, which therefore never had a true opportunity, except in some countries, such as Malawi, such as Brazil to a certain extent, which has never been given the real opportunity to prove that it could be highly productive and highly beneficial for diminishing rural poverty. There has been historically a prejudice against that kind of small-scale farming, and basically governments have never been interested in truly investing in them and trusting the ability for small-scale farming to feed the local populations. And this has resulted historically in a situation in which small-scale farming was not viable. Many people thus migrated to the cities, leading to the creation of slums in the cities in developing countries, and the choice of governments was then to import food to feed these urban populations, further worsening the family farms of the local producers. So that is one problem. This prejudice that, as a result of this history, it makes it difficult to imagine that small-scale farming can be actually a solution. And the second difficulty which I'd like to highlight is that large-scale industrial plantations are very competitive. They are good at economizing labor. They produce vast volumes and therefore can satisfy the demands of global and regional markets. And they are able to basically produce at a price which allows them to give cheap food to the markets that they serve. However, they create huge negative social and environmental externalities. In other terms, they produce social costs which they are not accounting for in the price of the food that they put on the markets. And secondly, they do not render the services that small-scale family farming does render. Small-scale family farming can be highly productive per hectare, although it is more labor-intensive per definition. Basically, small farms substitute labor for capital since they do not have access to the same type of machinery and they do not practice basically the same type of farming. But as a result, they create employment in regions where underemployment is huge, the rural areas in developing countries. They contribute to rural development as a result, which has multiplier effects on the local economy, and they are much better at managing the ecosystems. I recently presented a report on agroecology and the right to food and how sustainable farming, eco-farming, can feed the world, and it was very clear that small farms have advantages over large plantations because they are better at managing a diversity of crops, trees and animals on the same plot of land, which is the best way to mimic on the field not the industrial processes of the industry, but rather the natural processes of nature, the natural cycles of nature, using the complementarity between different plants, trees, and animals. And so, for all these reasons, I believe that we now must move beyond what is often seen as the only choice we have, which is either large-scale plantations developing as a result of investors taking over, or just the statu quo and subsistence farming, which is not indeed viable in many cases. We have to create a third way, which is really strong support for small-scale family farming. There are ways to do this which are relatively economical, which really require good governance mechanisms, organizing farmers, investing in order to allow them to have access to markets by some infrastructural investments and investments in public goods. And if we achieve this, we can really succeed, not just in producing more food, but also in reducing rural poverty.
Questions?
Yeah, my question is, most African nations are now, they live in poverty, they live in food aid. In the real sense, the cause of poverty and food shortage for most African nations is not lack of resource, but lack of good governance. In this regard, say Ethiopia is now one of the victims of this land grab. In the first place, the land grab, the farmers are dislocated without their willingness. They are forced, they're told with different reasons, like they'll be given pure water, drinking water, health service or sea. And because of that, they are dislocated from their location and they're taken somewhere else. And then the lands which they have been using, this has not been a land in Ethiopia. Most of the lands are not uncultivated lands, but lands that had been used by small farmers.
Can you forward a question?
Yeah, I'm just, no, first of all I have to brief, somehow give some pictures. And, these people, they are dislocated without their willingness. And at the same time, Ethiopia is one of the countries who is suffering with chronic food shortage. And the international community knows it, that we live on food aid. But, you know, with such situations, we need, say, poverty reduction, sustainable development, say, food shortage could be avoided if there is good governance. How far are the World Bank, the USAID, the United Kingdom, the IDF, the IDF or something, they are all working, to tell you the fact, they are all working with the Ethiopian government, despite that it is an authoritarian or dictatorial government. And how do we expect this land grab could make any difference to the social life of Ethiopians, the poor Ethiopian farmers?
We just ask very quickly for a very quick answer, because we only have 5 more minutes for this press briefing. Of course, you can go ahead after 2 o'clock individually, but maybe Ruth and Greg can have a very quick answer to that.
Clearly, quite a few of the countries in Africa that are the hotspots of land deals or land grabbing are countries that are food insecure themselves. And some of the countries that you mentioned, countries in East Africa and the Horn region, Ethiopia, Sudan, have been among the top targets for large-scale acquisitions by companies from the Gulf states, from India, from China. But I would emphasize that some of the investors in these regions are also European companies, American companies, and investment funds who are looking to these regions as a source not only of food for their domestic markets, but also as a source of fuel. A lot of the debate about global land grabbing is about who is going to get the food, but what we find is from global reviews, but also regional, more detailed studies, is that a lot of the land being acquired is not being acquired for the production of food, whether for domestic or foreign markets, but in fact is for the production of feedstocks for agrofuels or biofuels. In Southern Africa, most of the deals that we're seeing being struck are for either mining, forestry or biofuels. Food production, in fact, is in the minority. So I would emphasize that food is not always the priority of the investors. And secondly, some of the studies that have been conducted, including the study by the World Bank last year, pointed to the very disconcerting finding that some of the areas favored by investors as targets for their investment are in fact places with very weak governance, and particularly very weak enshrining of customary land rights. This is what makes access to that land more facilitated.
Let's get to very quickly say something.
Very briefly, I would agree. Governance is the issue. And what that requires then is the host or the target countries working on building governance institutions. And it would also require working with local communities and smallholder farmers in building their own governance capabilities to manage their resources, and then eventually to enter into negotiations for themselves rather than having the government involved in that negotiation process. So again, that you have to start with the fact that you've got to recognize those property rights which exist. And that then would empower people, individuals and communities and groups, to be able to make or start the negotiation process. Just the second thing I would say very quickly is that I think it's important to distinguish between large-scale farms and private investment. In some cases, indeed, large-scale farms are inappropriate. But that doesn't preclude the fact that we really need to encourage private sector investment into agriculture, because the public sector doesn't have the resources to be able to promote enough agriculture around the world to feed people. And so it's not going to take place unless private sector investments take place. So one of the things we should be thinking about is, okay, we have a lot of data and we have a lot of research taking place that's being presented at this conference. Now, how do we bring the private sector to the table and have a nuanced discussion with private sector about what's going to work best based upon our best case scenarios, and what works better and what works less better.
Yes.
Okay, can I just ask very briefly, you presented this third way, but how realistic is it given this weakness, given the powers that are out there? and perhaps how Sophia would respond in terms of wanting to see that third way coming about from her view.
No, this is why I think, although empowering local communities to allow them to decide what shall happen with the resources on which they depend is vitally important, I do not think it is sufficient. I think what should be emphasized is also the need for the rural populations, and particularly smallholders organizations, to have a say in the decision-making process at the national level. Historically, small farmers have been marginalized both economically and politically. They've never had a say in the way the priorities were defined by the national governments, and as a result, the choices have never benefited them. So political participation of farmers, which has been generally completely neglected, mostly because the governments depended on the support of the local urban elites rather than on the rural populations, is absolutely key. And it will not suffice just to empower the local communities and allow them to give their free, prior, informed consent to land changing hands. It is very important that in the way the priorities are set, small farmers have a say in the decision. And if that occurs, then most likely we will have more investment going to the type of poverty-reducing investment in rural areas, and that third way will then become realistic. It's also important that countries adopt strategies over a number of years to which they plan these measures they have to take to move in this direction. It will not happen all at once, but once you define the pathway by which you can arrive at this objective, it ceases to become utopian. It becomes something perfectly realistic once you define the pathway. This is why, from the right to food perspective, we advocate national strategies for the realization of the right to food. It's a governance tool to channel agricultural development in the right direction.
Sophia, very quickly.
On that question, I think there is no one single answer to that, and I think the third way will look very differently, of course, in different places. Now, what it is important, I think, is that to have clear that without a strong role for the state, for public and mandatory regulation, to curb the power of the private sector, of speculation, the speculative actors in the financial markets, to curb the power of transnational companies, just setting the rules of the game in many, many places, we won't have that.
We ran out of time. Just one more last question.
Okay, well, I had two quick questions, if possible. It's just about there was talk about the defences of small farmers being protected and strengthened, and what practical ways could this happen? And my second question was on the role of investment funds, and is there a need for greater regulation in this?
Well, maybe that's a very broad question. Maybe
The first.
it can be also your last parting chance. Each of you can just very quickly respond to that, and that closes our.
Well, on the last one, on the need of financial regulation, yes, we definitely agree that there is a great need of regulating financial markets. There are different proposals. Olivier has presented some proposals, for instance, to curb the price volatility of commodities and foodstuffs. We would like also to find more ways to regulate, because financial activists have pointed to us that as soon as you put in place a regulation or financial markets, financial actors will quickly find a way to bypass that regulation. So we need to look for complementary strategies and not put all our hopes in just one single regulation in one policy field, like, for instance, financial. We also need to talk about trade, about agricultural policies, about many, many other things in order to protect small-scale farming. That was your question.
What was your first question?
It was about how could there be practical ways to strengthen the defences of small farmers. That's something that was mentioned today.
I've already mentioned this, but getting the governance right first, right? So focusing on land tenure and property rights for the farmers. And there are a number of technical things that you can do to do that. So it's not just about land titling or land registration, but finding ways to actually help smallholders to secure their rights and get them recognized in statutory law. So whether they're held customarily or statutorily, getting those rights recognized is probably the first step.
Yes, I think what's really important is also what Gerge Myers said earlier on, which is that these reforms should precede, the further spread of investment, because otherwise the framework will simply not be adequate to control this. I would say that absolutely key is the organization of farmers, so that they are not, they are able to weigh upon the decisions, and also it's extremely important to realize that while the transposition of Western conceptions of property rights is not adequate and has often failed and has had counterproductive effects in some cases, customary forms of tenure, which are so often presented as the alternative, are also very problematic in certain respects. For example, they are discriminatory against women, they give lots of power to the local chiefs who represent the local communities and so on. So what we need to do is allow land users' rights to be recognized, while at the same time ensuring that the customary forms of tenure will not perpetuate means of exclusion and discrimination which have been their mark in the past. And there are ways of doing this. I don't have time to enter into the details, but it's basically taking as departure point the role of local communities in mapping the uses of land and different land rights, but with a control from the central authorities to make sure that this is done in accordance with human rights.
The establishment of regulation and norms at a multilateral level is clearly a very important part of the answer, but I would emphasize that the regulations and institutions that really will enable small-scale farmers to either resist claims on their land by large corporations, or to leverage and negotiate preferable or better terms in these deals, is really at national level. And for instance, within Africa, we have the African Union Land Policy Guidelines, and I would argue that as well as looking to the international community for guidelines and regulation, it's very important also for effort to be made to consolidate laws and institutions that can give legal and practical weight to people's customary land rights at a national level.
Well, thank you very much. We ran out of time, and then of course you can pursue individually. And our friend is also available for individual interview at the time. So you can also